Well, thanks for joining us, guys. I think a lot of people in the audience will know the companies you've invested in, know some of your firms, but because each firm kind of is a little bit different, I thought it would be good and helpful to just start with like how you guys see each of your firms fitting into the VC ecosystem. If you guys have a sweet spot, what is that? I know that enterprise is not where to start with you, Nicole, and Mike. You don't invest in unicorns when they're already unicorns. So if we could, we're not going to go back and forth the whole time, I promise. But if we could, just the first time, introduce a little bit about each of your funds, that would be really helpful.
Okay, should I start? Okay.
Yeah, Mike.
My name is Mike Maples. I'm co-founder and managing partner of FLOODGATE. Our basic belief is that even though tech brings abundance to the entire world, that there's a tiny fraction of entrepreneurs who create the companies that move the needle. And I like to call those founders the prime movers. I think that they're special, and my job is to find those prime movers before the rest of the world believes, before there's product market fit, before there's a parade to jump in front of. And so, we invested in Twitter when they weren't sure what to call it. It was either Voicemail 2.0 or TWTTR. We invested in Twitch when it was Justin.tv and Justin livecasting his life. And so, we try to find these things too early, way too early, or legally ambiguously too early, and then give the founders unconditional love from then on.
Cool.
Yeah, and I think ours is, we're a unique venture firm because we both invent and invest. So we founded over 20 companies last year. We're also unique in everything we invent or invest in typically has a corporate partner with us. So we activate that corporate capital that's parked on balance sheets. And then we're unique in our size. We're about 530 people. And so we're quite global with centers in Los Angeles, New York, Berlin, London, Shanghai, Tokyo, Sydney. So we kind of look at that global play, and we're very, very early stage. So we'll take anything from an entrepreneur with an idea all the way to about Series A.
And Jeff, just for people who maybe don't know quite like how corporate VC works or kind of how these partnerships work across a big organization, do you guys have a dedicated fund size, or is it kind of add as you go, or what happens?
We have a couple funds. We have a captive fund to us. It's about 150 million that we use. Then we have a fund where we're the major LP investor in. It's about a $250 million fund, run by a couple guys, Raj Ganguly, ex-Bancap, and then Eduardo Seven, ex-Facebook founder. And then we create a host of special purpose vehicles with our corporate partners. So we're accessing about $2 trillion parked on balance sheets. We're not using that much, but it gives us a very unique way, and we invest in things that have market value, but also some way drive those strategic core assets, and that typically gives them unfair advantages.
So Lightspeed are a little bit different again. We primarily do Series A and Series B investing. We also, though, have a global approach and really believe in finding amazing companies, not just in Silicon Valley, but all across America and the rest of the world. So for that reason, we have offices in Israel, China, India, in addition to Silicon Valley. We have about $4.5 billion assets under management. We just raised our 11th fund, which is a $1.2 billion fund. And while Series A and Series B are our sweet spots, I often remind my partners that some of our best investments have been the ones that we did at the seed stage. So Snapchat, Stitch Fix, Honest Company were all companies where they had amazing early traction and just incredible founders. So we will invest right from seed through Series D.
So I'm going to stay with you for a sec. A $1.2 billion fund seems like a huge amount of money to me. Is it the number of people that work at a firm that dictates having that much money, or why would one need over $1 billion to invest in startups right now if a lot of the value is being found at this very early stage for a lot of these companies?
It's a good question. That actually was one of my worries. 1.2 billion is certainly a very large stage fund, but we have separated that into two funds. So we've got 700 million for early stage, seed to B, and then 500 million for follow-on investments. And what I really love about that is the fact that we can say to entrepreneurs, listen, like if we back you, seed, Series A, Series B, and then private or public markets start to dry up in the future, because hopefully when you're building your business, this is a 10-year journey plus, more than 10 years that you're going into, at least we can say, well, we have powder dry, some money set aside specifically to follow on in those prior investments. So that's how we think about the larger stage fund.
Okay. So one thing I'm always mindful of is when you have such like value, different perspectives here, how do we get the most out of you? And so I'm going to play a thought exercise with you guys. I'm going to start with Mike, which is if we were doing this panel a year ago, same conference, obviously we have a smarter audience this year, but let's pretend we're a year ago. How would you guys have described the venture landscape compared to what we see today? Are there any differences? Would we be having a macro conversation or framework that would have been roughly similar 12 months ago, Mike?
I think everybody has their own take on it. My basic point of view is that there's about 5 exits a year realized at more than $1 billion through good times and bad, and that it really doesn't matter what stage of investor you are. If you don't have an unfair advantage to invest in those companies, you just don't have a business. You have no business being a VC. And so, our job is to try to invest too early or way too early, but in the end, the objective function is the same, find a path to those companies. I think that people tend to over-focus on kind of the sawtooth, the gyrations of how people feel from time to time. But if I were a founder, I wouldn't worry too much about macro VC stuff. I would build a company that leverages the exponential forces of Moore's Law and Metcalfe's Law. That overcomes any short-term market blip. And so it's about creating a company that brings abundance, that solves hard problems, that connects people. And what I find is usually the rest takes care of itself.
Jeff, would you agree, or how noisy do you feel like the market is right now for venture investment?
I mean, if you look at it at a macro level, 2017 is almost identical to 2016, right? And 2016 had the least amount of IPOs since, I think, 2009. So you probably will see with the current administration, at least in the US, a lot more IPOs. We think that could happen. But I think I more agree with Mike that, our businesses that we're investing in or we're founding, they're all going to pivot, right? They're all pivoting to find product market fit. And if they're good business models, they're recession-proof, they're down-rounding proof, they're gonna have a through-cycle view. And I think for the entrepreneurs out there, decisions you make in your company, you should have more options post a decision than you had prior. It was probably a bad decision. That's what we tell them. And my wife says, "What about marriage?" And I'm like, "Well, that's the outlier." Those are the types of things, having a through-cycle view, having a business model, and being able to pivot that model as the product market fits, and having more options on the decisions you make than you had prior. And I think you're going to be in a good spot.
So I guess this time last year, we definitely were worried. I guess partly from a macro perspective, given a lot of uncertainty going on in the world, partly from a valuation standpoint of these private companies, given we were starting to see some down rounds and some layoffs in San Francisco. But for us personally, what we were worried about, or what I was worried about, is that we're in between platforms. And so last year, we were just sort of thinking, okay, well, does it make sense to invest right now in companies given that hopefully the next platform will take off? And so now we are still in between platforms, but in my mind, we have more clarity about what might be the next platform. And I'm sure we all have different views on this. Some are saying AR, some are, well, our view is that voice first is a really interesting next area to invest in. So if you think about it, we're all saying, okay, we are going to have the whole entire world connected. But if you think about it, we have 3 billion people connected, probably another 4 billion people that need to come online. But we're missing one vital thing, which is that a lot of those people are illiterate. So how are they going to use the desktops, tablets, and iPhones that we use today? And so with voice first, we feel like that might be an interesting way to actually be able to connect the entire world. And so whether it's starting with Alexa or Google Home or Siri, we question whether that potentially might be a really interesting next platform.
I'm going to cheat and call back something that Mike told me, I want to say a year and a half ago.
Oh boy.
Mike, you told me, I was asking about your your big wins in your career, and if there was a pattern to how you found them. And what I remember you telling me, at least then, who knows if where you were, if you even remembered talking to me, but what you said at that moment was you remembered that none of these really big wins were super competitive at the time you invested, or particularly obvious at the time.
Yeah.
So what does that mean for an entrepreneur in the audience today? Like how do they become a diamond in the rough and get noticed when they're being also told, like, know your branding, know who your competitors are, know that there are hundreds of companies pitching you guys every day? Because looking at it just from the success standpoint, it's sort of like, oh, well, that's great. This was a company that was an ugly duckling and it turned into $1 billion company. But for everyone else, they're like, well, how do I become the ugly duckling?
Yeah, well, okay, so just a couple of thoughts there. The first thing that I'm a sucker for is founders who are focused on first principles rather than just kind of I'm X for Y. So I'll give you an example. The Lyft guys, it wasn't even called Lyft at the time, it was Zimride. And Logan and John come in and they say, we believe that there's enough parking space to cover the state of Connecticut. Cars are 3% capacity utilized. We believe that the network in mobile is going to cause a revolution in transportation from dollars per car to dollars per mile. And so I like to invest in those kinds of people. I like to invest in people who have a first principle assumption that you reason up from. Ev said, if 1 million people write blogs, I think maybe 10 people will write microblogs, and the burden of proof is on the negative. And so I like people who have an exponential insight, first principles. I like to believe that the founders have the stuff. And interestingly, the best founders I've backed don't really care whether the VCs agree with them or not. The best founders I've ever backed, they're going to do it, regardless of whether the VCs give them money or not. And like this idea that a great founder that's empowered needs VCs to make their vision a reality, I view as weak sauce. And so do they, right? And so the best founders I know will inflict their company on this world because they're so passionate and convinced that they're right that they can't imagine doing anything else with the gift of their time in this life. And so, my job is always to ride shotgun. I don't think that founders should worry too much about impressing VCs. I think founders should pursue their life's passion and do something great, and the VCs that have a lick of sense will follow them eventually.
So inflict is sort of a very combative vision I'm getting there.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, Jeff said backstage that a lot of your successes have come from co-creation, from basically co-launching companies with entrepreneurs. So how do you spot those successes, and sort of how does that type of process fit into this scenario?
Well, again, I go back to options. You want as many options as you can, and we're inventing companies. We'll invent 40 this year, right? We'll found 40. And we have 500 people in DV, and everybody says, why do you have so many people? Because all of them are entrepreneurs. And we acquire a lot of broken startups, entrepreneurs that tried, didn't get funding, but we like the team, we like the IP. We say, come join us. We'll find another one, we'll put you into it. And so we're quite good at doing that. And I think if you look at early stage in Angel, we put probably $50 million to work last year in Angel. But that's between sweat equity and cash. And what we find is the early stage guys, they don't necessarily need a lot of cash. They need help. And they need help to pivot. And we've had a lot of pattern recognition to see how they pivot and how they change. So we give them that. And then we focus, we don't focus on apps, and I like the voice, we focus on platforms. So we look for platforms. Apps go away, they're point solutions. And so we think about platforms, we think about this idea of Trojan horses. So if you think about a Trojan horse, the iPhone is a Trojan horse to the app. The app's iTunes is a Trojan horse to the App Store. Right? Now you have a platform play. And so we constantly look for that, and we constantly focus our entrepreneurs that are working on things, or the things that we're inventing are platform plays. They're not apps, they're not nice to haves, they're not things that are going to go away, but they're through cycle views.
So now I'm going to try to tie those two together with you, Nicole. So you have to bear with me. So circle back to what you said about voice. And let's say we love Alexa. We think there's a lot of cool opportunities for how, let's say, work software is interfacing with voice. You kind of have a thesis like that. Is it okay to try to start a company or position a company around a big trend like that, or is that too much of following the wave there? You know, where if something is exciting like that, it means a lot of other people have the same realization.
So a couple of things on that. I never shy away from companies where there's others who are also coming to the same realization, because I actually think that if there's many different companies starting the same idea, then it shows that something's happening in that space. Like there's movement, there's excitement in that space, and so quite often you'll see that happens when the time is right. And I'm always asking, is this the right idea? Is this the right team? Is this the right time? So quite often when a lot of companies are starting something, often it shows it's the right time. Not always, but often. And then from those companies, I think that it's very important to sort of think about the team in the early days. And I love Mike's point about inflicting your company on the world. Honestly, could not have said that better. And so I think that if you find a founder who is willing to run through walls to get something done, is just not like, it's like where there's a will, there's a way. They will not take no for an answer. That is something I love. And so, yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to find. And with regards to your point on trends, I guess there's two things. Like a lot of our job is reactionary, and a lot of it, so like if we are introduced to an amazing founder, absolutely. We want to meet those founders and find out what they're building. But also the other part is like, it's thesis driven. And so it is thinking, what are the new trends? What would we like to, what do we think is going to be the next big thing? And then who are the right people to be building companies within that?
So I'm curious, can we get a show of hands? How many people here either work at a startup or have co-created a startup or plan to in the near future? Raise your hand. It's a lot of people. So Collision asked you guys not to run through the wall at the end of this to impress these guys. So please stay in your seats.
Run through curtains, though. That's fine.
Okay, but for those people in the audience, the real reason I asked is when we look at what's happening with unicorns today, with what looks like a few IPOs happening, some major M&A, especially in the consumer space, should entrepreneurs in the audience who maybe are at much younger companies care about that at all? Is there anything that they can learn from what's happening with the unicorns that could inform their businesses?
Well, when I step back from it, we've done some analysis. If you look at 2001 to the present day, there's about 5 realized billion-dollar exits a year. And right now we have, 220 some odd private unicorns. And so you either believe there's a 40-year supply of exits sitting out there, or maybe some of them aren't going to end up being worth $1 billion, because there's new companies getting created all the time too. Having said that, to me the real lesson is some people just raised money ahead of their business, and they thought that their product was their valuation, and they got into this mode of status seeking, saying, I've got a unicorn valuation, come work at my company. And in the end, how high your valuation you set is kind of like a pole that you've got to jump over in the Olympics, right? And you can easily know height if you're not careful. And so I guess, like if I were an entrepreneur, the only thing I would take away from this is build an awesome company based on your secret, syndicate the truth, and raise money, on the path of progress to being great, and don't get caught up in the noise and the BS and the hype around, oh, I want to be a unicorn because my buddy's a unicorn. Being a unicorn only matters when you get liquid. Otherwise, it's just talk.
Yeah, and I think we look at it like if you're shooting for the unicorn and that exit, you're probably thinking about the wrong thing. Most of you will all fail on that idea. And so we look for, again, there's lots of exits out there that are not unicorn exits, and our hit rate historically has been about 1 in 3. So we're pretty good at figuring out both market and strategic value. But what we try to do is we try to look for friction, and without friction, you're a bit of a solution in search of a problem. And the idea there is you have market friction, and we're looking for a social change, a technology change, a regulatory change, something there that's creating an addressable market that wasn't there. You're not going to out-Facebook Facebook, so don't be focused on doing that. Then second, we look for expected friction. These are pain points or emotions that give you access to that market. And then third, we look for an experience that you're designing or have created that allows you to make money in that market. If you get those three things right, you'll be successful. And that's what we try to focus our entrepreneurs on. That's what we try to focus on when we're founding companies is, do we have those three frictions right? Will this company be successful? But if you get those things aligned, you have a much better chance of being successful than otherwise.
And I often think about IPOs and M&A from my prior career. I spent a decade at Morgan Stanley where I was doing equity research for consumer and tech companies. And so it's interesting now, a lot of my Series B companies will be talking about IPOing. And they'll say, oh, the timing's great right now. Should we IPO? I'm like, okay. When you think about an IPO, you've got to be at the right stage in your company life cycle, and you've got to be at the right time in the market. And when those two come together, when they align, then absolutely, for you, it's the right time to IPO. So certainly don't do that too early. And with regards to M&A, there is definitely a lot of very exciting M&A happening right now. With Jet being bought for $3 billion, I often think that something's only worth what someone's willing to pay for it. And so I always think about WhatsApp being bought for $19 billion by Facebook. Well, it makes sense. Facebook was willing to pay 10% of their market cap at the time to essentially acquire a declining customer base of theirs. And so with M&A, it does make sense that something's only worth what someone's willing to pay for it. And so we are definitely seeing a lot of companies like Walmart trying to compete with the Amazons of the world, and so going into an M&A frenzy, and a hiring frenzy for that matter too. And so how long that'll continue, we don't know, but certainly interesting right now.
What about when we see the sort of mea culpas or postmortems of startups that hit major difficulties, and one of the reasons that they seem to point to a lot today is what we raised money against is not what people want right now. So for example, when we raised our Series B 2 or 3 years ago, we were told hypergrowth, 100% growth or better, figure out profitability later, and now it seems like VCs only want profitability. And then I'm sure you guys would say, well, no, we actually want both or something like that. But is there a way is it true that expectations do shift? And if you're a founder, how do you avoid getting caught on sort of the wrong side of whatever the flavor is in that moment?
Yeah, it's funny, some of you may have experienced this. You're going to find that you get all kinds of advice as a founder. You'll have advisors, you'll have VCs, you'll have hangers-on, all these people. And one of the most important decisions you can make as a founder is who do you trust and whose advice do you take? Because people going crazy when they shouldn't because they got advice from their VCs, got bad advice and picked the wrong people to listen to. And so in the end, it's your company that you want to make awesome, and it's like the people that you want in the boardroom are the people that when the chips are down, they're going to give you good advice, and you can choose to take it or leave it, but that it's not this cacophony of sound just creating noise in the environment with lots of different direction vectors of where to go. So like deciding who you want to take advice from is just fundamental.
Yeah, and I think we look at it, and whether it's early stage, you're typically not profitable, right? So you're either pre-rev or rev pre-profit. So we talk about scale. Scale matters. And what scale means, scale can mean you have 150 people working for you. Scale can mean you can have 4. But if you have scale, then your business has some consistency to it. And then you have a through cycle view that you otherwise wouldn't have. So we look for how do you get to scale and what does scale mean? And that's what we focus on versus the profitability, unprofit, growth, not growth. It's really a scale question in our mind.
Yeah. And I would just say that, yeah, things are always changing based on timing, based on geography, because a New York VC may tell you that they really value profitability. Silicon Valley VC will tell you not to worry about that anytime soon. And then things that are changing based on which VC you go with. But to Mike's point, I think that, yeah, care about who you take advice from. And even more than that, like, think about this as, for the next 10 plus years of your life, who do you want on your board? Think of it as a marriage, except for the fact that in a marriage you can get a divorce, and it is much harder to get somebody off your board, off your cap table. So with that in mind, you've got to think about who do you get on with? Who do you have the chemistry with? Who do you value their opinion? And who do you think you can learn and grow together with? So those are the things we think about.
Well, thank you guys for giving everyone all this advice today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for starting your companies.